Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast.
Whew, okay. Hello guys. I just got back from a run, and let's just put it this way. I don't run. I am not a long-distance runner. I would not even classify myself as a runner. I sprint, okay? And I only sprint when I'm terrified of something or if I'm feeling super alive and in the moment. And it's very short-lived. But I'm trying to do this thing lately where I push myself out of my comfort zones. And it's kind of hard. But I think back to starting this podcast and I had no idea what I was doing. I just kind of started it and figured it out as I went. And I feel like that's kind of what I do with life a lot of times. I don't have a full set of plans in front of me and I just head off in a direction anyway. And it may not always be the right direction, but I feel like I always learn things. And I don't know, I've had a lot of change recently in my life, especially in regards to my career. And that has been hard, but I think it's also been better for me in the long run. It's given me more time to focus on this podcast and the things that really light me up. One of those things is writing. I've been working on writing a book. And I know this is a Nancy Drew podcast and you came here for Nancy Drew, but this was just on my mind this morning. And I just wanted to say that sometimes the hardest things in life are the most worth doing. So if you're going through a hard time too, just know that you're not alone and we'll get through this. Okay, I think I've sufficiently caught my breath and I'm hydrated now. So we're going to jump to the book that we're talking about today. This is book number 104, The Mystery of the Jade Tiger, and it came out in 1991. So the book cover for this book, it's a blue book. And Nancy herself is in an art gallery, and there's a boy behind her, kind of looking over his shoulder at Nancy. And she's in the foreground. She's wearing this red blazer, and she's looking at this Jade Tiger that's on display. It's a pretty cool cover. Nancy's very blonde in this cover. I feel like the art for Nancy over the last couple covers has been pretty similar. Similar hairstyles, similar hair color. But when it comes to giving this book cover a funny cover spoof, I would say the mystery of why Nancy, an 18-year-old girl who has never had a real job, is wearing a blazer. I know blazers were very in style, like in the late 80s, early 90s, but it's kind of funny. And as far as giving this book cover a rating goes, I would give it 2 magnifying glasses. It's okay. It's not my favorite. Now, really quickly, I'll go ahead and read off the characters that we meet in The Mystery of the Jade Tiger. So first up is Joanne Coslow, who is a friend of Bess's, and her fiancé, Keith. There is Terry Kirkland, who's an artist, and Amy, his daughter. Lon was Amy's mother. She has passed away, but she's mentioned in this book. Detective Brower. Nick Finney, who was in the Vietnam unit that Terry was in during the Vietnam War. Lai, who is a Doberman. Mr. Ben Mai, aka the Kingfisher, who owns this art gallery. Officer Harlan. Jimmy Thew, who is the boy with the dragon earring. Leon Isaacs, owner of another gallery in town. Allison Sayers, who is a lawyer that helps Nancy out, Miss Shields, Amy's teacher at school, Patricia, a friend of Amy's, and Officer Grant, another police officer. Okay, so I'll go ahead and read a synopsis for The Mystery of the Jade Tiger. Nancy's in California to investigate a series of break-ins at the home of her father's friend, Terry Kirkland. A Vietnam vet, Terry came away from the conflict with a trunk full of memories, but unknown to him, the trunk also holds a mystery, an exotic secret that now threatens to destroy his family. A twisted trail of intrigue and corruption leads Nancy to a shocking revelation. The truth behind the burglaries rests with the soldier who vanished on a top-secret mission, but the trail of the tiger doesn't end in the jungle. It leads right to Terry's door. And now for a dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. Jade Tiger theft solved. All things point back to Vietnam. And now we'll go ahead and jump into the direct quotes and notes that I took down for this book. So the book says the girls are attending the wedding of a friend, Joanne Coslow, who used to be a neighbor of Bess's. And it's funny, in reading several of these last books and some of the books after this one, there's a lot of Nancy's neighbors or Bess or George's neighbors that end up having these mysteries for Nancy to solve. But Nancy thinks to herself that Joanne is anything but traditional, especially when it comes to her taste in clothing. Joanne is marrying her boyfriend Keith out in California where they live, and she's a photographer out there. Bess says George needs to hurry and find a dress for the wedding. And about this time, Mr. Drew comes out of his study, and George asks him jokingly if there are any laws against forced shopping, and he says he'll look into it. Bess is always the one that's up for shopping. George is like, you know what, I think I'll pass. Shopping can be exhausting sometimes. So Carson tells Nancy that his friend out in California, Terry Kirkland, who is a stained glass artist, has been having a hard time since his wife died. He's now responsible for raising their daughter Amy alone, but their house has been broken into twice in the last week alone. The last babysitter quit, and Terry needs to find another one. He has some art shows coming up, and he can't take Amy with him. So Carson asks Nancy if she'd be willing to help out while she's in California, and she says she would. Then Carson is like, oh good, because I already told him you would. Dang, thanks a lot, Carson. But Carson says Terry has 3 shows coming up, and Bess says she and George can help with the wedding while Nancy helps with Amy. And George says she'd rather help with the case than the wedding. But George's catering skills from a past mystery, The Double Horror of Finley Place, are mentioned. I love when the series keeps up with details like that. I'm kind of curious if George's stint as a ice cream truck driver from A Secret in Time is ever going to come up again. So in this mystery, the girls go to San Francisco, and it's February, so winter time. And this is not the first time that Nancy has solved a case in San Francisco. I think other books where Nancy has gone to San Francisco are The Mystery of the Fire Dragon, The Clue in the Camera, and The Silent Suspect. So I think this is the 4th book set there. But according to this book, Amy, Terry's daughter, is also part Vietnamese. Her mother was from Vietnam. So when they get out to California, Nancy asks about the break-ins, and Terry says mostly electronics have been taken. He says they had an alarm system installed before the second break-in, but the thieves still got in and disarmed it somehow. And the weird thing is, none of Terry's art was stolen. And it's pretty valuable, but Nancy says it would probably be too hard to resell. It's very recognizable. So Terry drives them to his house, which is in Cherry Creek, and as they're pulling up the driveway, there's an explosion and the van teeters towards a ravine. Terry's able to get out and see one of their tires was blown, and about that time, they see a red car speed out of the driveway. It's not someone the Kirklands recognize. So they have to walk the rest of the way on foot up to the house, and the girls finally see the house, which looks like a tree house. Terry says his wife Lon helped design it. But he says he's afraid the person in the car was a thief because he notes that the alarm system's wires have been cut, and he bets the phone lines have been too. The system is set up to alert the police when it's tripped, so the thief must have known that. So everybody goes in and they assess the damage, and the house has been ransacked. Furniture has been slashed, paintings destroyed, and things have been thrown around the room. And the phone lines have been cut, so the police are not coming. So Nancy and Terry make sure no one is still in the house when Amy suddenly cries out. Her room has been torn apart, and she says the trunk is gone. Nancy and George ask what was in it, and Amy says just sweaters. But Nancy wonders if the trunk itself is valuable, and Terry says it isn't, but it does have a story to it. So Terry goes to call the police, and Detective Brower shows up with a technician to dust for fingerprints. A camera and some silver dollars seem to be missing from the house. So Nancy asks if maybe there was a picture on the camera the thief could have wanted destroyed, and Brower's like, who's running this investigation here? Terry starts to say Nancy is a detective, but she interrupts and says she's a friend, since the detective is kind of prickly. Detective Brower does not want Nancy interfering. So Terry says he wants the house watched, and Detective Brower says he doesn't have the people available to do that. Bess and Terry make the comment that he wasn't helpful at all. Now later that night, after the house is put back together, Nancy speculates that maybe the electronics being stolen was just a cover. Maybe it was to distract from what the thief really wanted. But Terry does tell the story of the trunk. He says he served in Vietnam and had a guy in his unit named Nick Finney. Terry and Nick had the same birthday and were both dumped by their girlfriends while they were deployed. So they kind of bonded over these things that they had in common. Terry tells them that Nick got sent out on a mission and asked him to watch the trunk. He never came back from that mission, and he was declared missing in action. So Terry shows the girls what was in the trunk, which he had removed previously. A pocket knife, a red bandana, and a Hotel Saigon keychain with no keys on it. Nothing special. But Terry says he never heard from Nick again. He tried to find any living family members that he could give the trunk to, but Nick didn't have any. So everyone goes to bed after this, and the next morning Nancy gets up. The book says she put on some jeans and a white and lavender striped rugby shirt. But when Nancy goes down for breakfast, Terry says the police called and just said they found no prints. So he and Nancy go out to look at the van's tire. It's still further down the driveway, and Nancy notes that there's a lot of woods around the house, making it easy for a thief to hide. But when they examine the tire, they find a bullet in it. Terry says it came from a Colt 45 1911A1. Nancy asks what Nick Finney looked like, and she's told he had red hair and got very good at concealing himself in Vietnam. But that's not good. Somebody literally shot out their tire. Someone means business. So they go back up to the house, and Nancy shows her friends the bullet. Bess almost chokes on her oatmeal when she sees it. Terry says when he invited them, the house had only been broken into twice, but now that it's happened again and they've been shot at, he doesn't think it's safe for them to stay there anymore. I mean, call me crazy, but I'd be a little bit uneasy to stay at someone's house if it had been broken into once. But Nancy looks to Bess and George, and Bess uncharacteristically speaks up and says she won't be chased out of the house. Terry says they'll stay for now, but if one more thing happens, they're leaving. So Terry takes the bullet to the police, and the girls and Amy go down to the beach. Later, when Nancy goes back up to the house, she finds Terry in his studio and she asks for his help. She wants to try and see the thief. So Terry, Bess, George, and Amy pretend to leave the house. They have a dress dummy wearing a wig and Nancy's sweater to make it look like Nancy went with them, while really she hangs back. So Nancy sits in the woods to watch the house, and an hour or two goes by when she thinks she sees a flicker of movement. She goes towards it and no one is there, but she sees a scrap of flannel on a bush. So someone was there, and they were watching her. Creepy. So Terry and the girls come back, but they say they weren't far. They were on the opposite side of the property. So the thief probably knew this and didn't attempt to break in. Now later that night, Joanne Coslow and Keith come by and they talk about the wedding. Bess ends up volunteering them all to help with the wedding decorations. They also chat about the couple's jobs. Joanne is a photographer and Keith is doing graduate work in Asian art history. Now the next morning, Nancy, Bess, George, and Amy go get decorating supplies while Terry is at an art show. It rains as the group is coming back home, and Amy says they'll have to park the car and walk up the driveway because it will be a muddy mess. So they do and leave their packages in the car to get later. Everyone else gets ahead of Nancy and she hears someone running in the woods, so she goes after them. Nancy sees a young boy, no older than 15, jumping on a motorbike. The book says he is of Asian descent and has a silver dragon earring in one ear. Nancy yells at him to stop and grabs his arm. She asks why he's running from the house and if he's the one who's been breaking in, and he just says, "Ask the Kingfisher," and takes off. So Nancy goes back up to the house, and Bess, George, and Amy are trying to decide what to have for dinner. Bess makes the comment she thought Nancy was already upstairs changing. Nancy asks if George knows what a kingfisher is, and she says it's some kind of bird. So Nancy tells them about the encounter with the boy in the woods and describes him to Amy. Amy's eyes widen at the description of the boy, but she changes the subject and says she wants to watch TV. So Nancy goes upstairs to shower and change. And later, Nancy, Bess, and George pull out bird guides, a local newspaper, and a phone book to try and find anything on kingfishers. George describes the kingfisher from the bird guide, and it says it's brightly colored, has a short tail and a long bill, and likes to eat fish. Bess, meanwhile, looks in the newspaper, and Nancy speculates maybe Kingfisher refers to a street gang or a political leader. I don't know why that was so funny to me, trying to picture a street gang or a politician going by the name of Kingfisher, but it seemed like a bit of a stretch. But of course, they don't find anything, and Nancy doesn't see anything in the phone book either. But when Terry gets home, Nancy tells him about the boy and mentions the word Kingfisher, and he says that was what they called jade in parts of Asia. He suggests they check out jewelry stores. So the next day, they call all the jewelry stores they can in Northern California, and they find 27 that sell jade, but don't know anything about kingfishers. Now, meanwhile, Bess calls Joanne about helping her with wedding decorations, and Nancy is discouraged about the lack of leads. When Bess calls her to the phone to talk to Joanne's fiancé, Keith tells Nancy that the finest jade in the world comes from Burma, and it's called Fet Sui. I hope I'm saying that right. Nancy looks in the phone book again, and sure enough, there is a Fet Sui gallery in Sausalito. So Nancy says she'll drop Bess and George off to help with decorations, and she goes on to Sausalito. The book says she's familiar with the area from helping one of Hannah's friends with a case. I think she's talking about book number 82, The Clue in the Camera. So Nancy parks and goes inside the Fet Sui gallery, and it has very expensive jade pieces, and they're varying shades of green. Nancy approaches a woman at a desk and says she's an Asian art history major and she wants to interview the owner. So the woman says the owner is Mr. Mai and he's not there right now, so Nancy leaves her name and Terry's phone number. She then decides to walk around Sausalito and goes in the alley behind the gallery. She sees some boxes and what looks like Nick Finney's trunk, but it looks like an axe has been taken to it. So while Nancy is studying it, she hears a growl and she sees a Doberman running straight towards her. It grabs the sleeve of Nancy's jacket, but then someone calls out the name Lie and calls the dog off, the boy with the dragon earring from the woods near Terry's house. So Nancy asks if that's his dog and he says yes. He tells her it's trained to attack strangers and she'd better leave. Nancy retorts that he told her to come there and ask for the kingfisher. So she asks if that's Mr. Mai and he says, "Very good, now leave." So Nancy leaves because she's scared of the dog, but the book says she's annoyed with being bossed around by a 14-year-old. I mean, I would be too. But I would also be scared of the dog. But when Nancy gets into her car, she decides she needs to try again and go back for the pieces of the trunk. She remembers a quilt in the trunk and she decides to wrap herself in it to protect herself from the dog's bites. I mean, I guess that'll do the trick. A quilt is sort of similar to that tactical wear that canine units wear. So Nancy goes down the alley wearing this quilt and the dog runs at her, but the quilt does the trick. She's able to take the pieces of the trunk and run back to the car unharmed. So Nancy brings the trunk pieces back to Terry. He's curious about why it was behind the gallery in the first place, but doesn't think it's got anything to do with Mr. Mai. Okay, I mean, it was literally found behind his gallery, but sure. Nancy says maybe he paid the boy to steal it, the one who was in the woods on Terry's property. Terry also isn't sure about that either, and he also says he wishes Nancy had gotten more than 9 pieces of the trunk. Excuse me, Nancy's the detective here. I think we should let her do the deducing. Also, she risked her life and she got 9 pieces of the trunk. Why he's complaining about that, I don't know. So Nancy leaves the trunk pieces with him and goes to the library because she wants to sound like she knows what she's talking about when it comes to Jade in case Mr. Mai calls her back for the interview. After being at the library for a while, Nancy is driving back to Terry and Amy's house and she wants to pull over to watch the sunset when she notices a dark red car tailgating her. So Nancy speeds up to put distance between herself and the other car, but it speeds up too. Nancy just wants to get down off this mountain road she's on because she doesn't want to go over the steep cliff. But the car continues to follow Nancy as she tries to make it to the nearest town. It even rams her a few times. But Nancy uses a trick her father told her about and pulls into the parking lot of a police station because she knows the man won't follow her. And she's right, the car speeds on by. That's a great tip from Carson Drew. But Nancy goes into the police station and she files a report with an officer who is Officer Harlan, who also escorts her back to Terry's house in case the man in the red car is waiting for her. When Nancy gets back there, Bess and George are waiting up for her and she tells them what happened. George and Bess speculate that maybe the man saw Nancy near the library and followed her then. Now about this time, Terry opens the door to his studio and he and Amy ask them to come inside. Terry shows the girls the newly reconstructed trunk and he also shows them how it had a false bottom. So Nancy says it could have hidden something illegal or valuable, and maybe that's what the thief was after. So while they're all talking, Mr. Mai calls and asks to talk to Nancy. She takes the phone from Terry and Mr. Mai tells her he's too busy to meet. When Nancy tells him she's writing a paper, she flatters him by saying she's heard of his expertise and he agrees to meet her the next day. So when Nancy hangs up, Terry says he also called Detective Brower and told him about the trunk. So he's coming by the next day also. Later, when Bess and George go see a movie, Nancy decides to talk to Terry more about Nick Finney. He says he doesn't think Nick is the one who broke in to reclaim something of his when Nancy brings that up, because he is sure that Nick is dead. But he does say Nancy could chat with the local veterans group because Nick was from the area, and they might have records on him. Now, the next day, Detective Brower comes by, and he and another technician dust the trunk for prints, then take Nancy, Terry, and Amy's prints before leaving. Detective Brower is rude to them again, and he doesn't even acknowledge Nancy when she asks if he's going to look into the Fete Sui gallery. He just leaves. So once he's gone, Nancy next calls several veteran resources, and then finally is able to hear more about Nick Finney, including his date of birth. He was only 18 when he went missing. She's also told he went on a secret mission with 11 other men, and he's presumed dead. So when Nancy gets off the phone, she has the thought that she is the same age as Nick Finney when he went missing, and she can't imagine what he saw in the jungles of Vietnam. We do get a description of Nancy's outfit she wears to see Mr. Mai: a white button-down blouse, a denim skirt, and a denim vest. Now, Bess and George say they're helping Joanne make casseroles for her wedding, and this is wild to me, but Joanne is DIYing to the max, which is really cool, don't get me wrong, but they list like 5 different kinds of casseroles they're making for this wedding, which is a lot. George seems really unhappy about it, and she says she'd rather ride mountain bikes, while Bess says she'd rather go to Calistoga and take a mud bath, which is funny because I'm like, Bess, you're the one that volunteered to help. But George asks Nancy if she's sure she wants to go by herself to the art gallery to see Mr. Mai, and Nancy says she'll go alone because she doesn't want him to get suspicious. So Nancy goes back to the gallery and the receptionist calls Mr. Mai in. He eventually comes out to talk to Nancy, who he finds looking at a jade dragon. He says in Buddhism, the dragon represents the east and the tiger represents the west. He asks Nancy what period she's focusing on in her art history class, and she says she's really not interested in a specific period, mostly just jade from Vietnam. Mr. Mai says he's from Vietnam and most pieces from there were made in the last 2 centuries, but Nancy feels as if she said something wrong and Mr. Mai is about to dismiss her. She wants to see what's in the back room, so she asks Mr. Mai if Vietnamese jade carvings are similar to Chinese ones, and he says yes, especially the carvings made for temples. Nancy quickly realizes through further questioning that Mr. Mai is very vain and loves talking about himself, so she's able to stretch the meeting out a little bit longer. But suddenly, the door to the back room opens and the boy with the dragon earring comes out. When he sees Nancy, he takes off running and she chases him out the door and through Sausalito. She eventually loses him though. So Nancy goes back to the gallery and she knows it's going to be really awkward explaining to Mr. Mai why she just ran off like that. So when Nancy gets back, Mr. Mai is very cold with her and she tells him she thought she recognized the boy, and Mr. Mai says that's his nephew Jimmy. Then he asks if Nancy always runs after people she thinks she recognizes, and Nancy blurts out she thought he might have stolen something, which just makes the whole situation 10 times more awkward. So Mr. Mai says that's an unkind assumption to make, and he tells Nancy Jimmy is his responsibility. His parents both died in Vietnam when he was 7. They drove over a landmine. Very sad. But Nancy can also tell by the way Mr. Mai talks about Jimmy that he's very indifferent about him. So Nancy secures another time to come talk to Mr. Mai and then she leaves. She goes to check in with Bess and George and Joanne, and they've made food for over 300 wedding guests, which is insane. I mean, I'm all for DIYing stuff, but they left out the part that there's 300 guests. You would not see me making 5 different kinds of casseroles plus the wedding cake for 300 guests. And I went to culinary school. No, thank you. But while they're working on all this stuff, Joanne is talking about this kimono she saw at a museum that she really wanted to wear for her wedding, and she says she snuck pictures of it with her camera. And Nancy gets an idea. So she asks if Joanne can come with her to the gallery for an hour the next day to secretly take some pictures. Joanne says she's supposed to be making her cake tomorrow, though. So again, she's not only cooking for 300 people, but she's making her own wedding cake. But Nancy says she'll help with the cake if Joanne helps her with the pictures, so they agree. The next day, Terry, Amy, and the girls load up to go to one of Terry's art shows. Now, while they're there, they meet a gallery owner from New York named Leon Isaacs. You don't really have to remember that name. He does not come up ever again. But Nancy, Bess, George, and Amy walk around the art show and they look at all the glass work. After a while, Nancy says they should go get Terry some lunch and then drive to see the redwood forests nearby. But when they go back to Terry's table, they can tell he's visibly shaken. They see that one of the glass boxes Terry made is broken, and Terry is pulling these dog tags out of the smashed case. He says he knows who smashed the box, but he can't believe he's back. And Nancy sees the name on the dog tags, and it's Nick Finney. Well, I guess it's safe to say that Nick Finney is not a patron of the arts. So Nancy starts to look around for him, but Terry says it's no use. Nick was trained for intelligence work, and he won't be found if he doesn't want to be. Terry's also afraid that Nick could already be on his way to the house, but Amy says anyone could have planted the dog tags. It doesn't mean Nick is necessarily back. So Terry says he's taking Amy to his sister's house because it's not safe at home. Amy pouts about this while they pack up the glass art pieces and says she hates Aunt Marge's cooking, but Terry says she's going and that's final. But when they get to Terry's sister's, her daughter has chickenpox and Amy never has, so she can't stay. Which this is wild to me. Why would you drive? Because they drive like 3 or 4 hours. Wouldn't you call first and just be like, hey, can you watch my kid? I mean, I think that's what I would do. But anyways, they all head back home. So the next day, Nancy meets Joanne for breakfast before going to the gallery, and she shows the sleuth her camera, a small spy-size one. They go over to the gallery, and Nancy says Joanne is her cousin and also into Asian art. Joanne says she specializes in kimonos, but Nancy asks a lot of questions and eventually comes up with a fake reason for for seeing the back room. She says she lost an earring the other day when she ran through there chasing Jimmy. Mr. Mai is resistant at first, but then he lets her look. So Nancy and Joanne look around in the back room, and Nancy sees a Jade Tiger. She asks why it's not out front, and the gallery owner says it's not for sale, but a private collector has bid on it. Mr. Mai reminds her of her missing earring, and Nancy continues to pretend to look for it, when she spots brass latches with dragons on them that look just like the ones from Nick Finney's trunk. So I think Mr. Mai is on to them after a few seconds because Nancy and Joanne are forced to leave, but when they get to their cars, Joanne says she was successful and she got pictures of the trunk latches, which she says they can develop and take to the police. So they split up, and Nancy goes to pick up Bess and George at the house so they can go help make the cake. We get descriptions of what both of them are wearing in this part of the book. The book says George is wearing red sweats and a headband and is stretching on the back deck, and Bess comes out wearing an aqua skirt and white shirt. So the girls meet up with Joanne to help make this cake that's going to feed 300 people. And oh, did I also mention it's going to be a chocolate carrot cake, and it's going to be shaped like a castle? This is one unique wedding, that's for sure. But Joanne tells them while they're baking she took the pictures to be developed and Keith is going to pick them up later. So Keith comes by with the developed pictures while they're baking, and they look at them. They look at the pictures of the latches, but Keith is more fascinated with the picture of the Jade Tiger. He says it looks like Burmese jade and is probably the most valuable piece at the gallery and is museum quality. So Nancy goes back to Terry's house after this to show him the pictures, and he's interested in the trunk latches. But he also gets distracted by the Jade Tiger and says it looks like something he saw in a temple while in Vietnam. Nancy notes that Amy has been on edge also ever since the glass box was smashed at the art show. Amy says they should show the pictures to the police, the case is closed, but Terry is hesitant because Nancy didn't get permission to take photos in the gallery from Mr. Mai. I mean, she couldn't exactly go up to him and be like, hey, I suspect you're guilty of illegal activity and have art pieces you're not supposed to have. Can I take pictures of your gallery? I mean, Nancy probably could have come up with something more elaborate and a better excuse. But Nancy and Terry talk about what could have been in the false bottom of the trunk, and Nancy says the trunk latches were directly next to the Jade Tiger, so maybe it was in the trunk. Terry says if that's the case, though, and the Jade Tiger was in there, he's afraid Nick stole it from this temple they were at in Vietnam. But Terry says he needs to see the weather forecast before his show tomorrow, so he turns the TV up, and then George exclaims, on the screen is the Jade Tiger, and a news story saying the Fête Suite Gallery was robbed, and the tiger was taken. It's worth over $70,000. That's one expensive cat. But they all say it's odd that the threats to them haven't stopped, even though the trunk was already removed from the house. Amy goes to bed after this without being told, and Nancy thinks that's peculiar. So the next morning, just Nancy, Bess, and George are there because Terry left for his art show, and Amy is at school when there's a knock on the door. It's Detective Brower, and he says Nancy is wanted for questioning in regards to the stolen Jade Tiger. So Nancy is taken down to the station, and Bess and George follow her there. Detective Brower starts with asking Nancy about her recent visits to the gallery, and she says she had been there. The policeman also says Mr. Mai told them Nancy had been around the back room twice and had seemed very taken with the tiger. Nancy says it would be dumb of her to call attention to an item if she were planning to steal it, though. And about that time, someone named Allison Sayers shows up. She walks in, and she's an attorney Carson knows. So Bess and George called him, and Carson got right on getting Nancy representation. So she has Nancy plead the fifth, and Brower gets so mad about this. But when Nancy finally gets reconnected with Bess and George, they go home. The next day, they flip a coin to see if they're going to go take mud baths or ride mountain bikes, and mountain bikes it is. So the book says Nancy wears navy leggings and a white sweatshirt, George wears cutoffs and a t-shirt under a blue windbreaker, and Bess wears black cycling shorts and a light green cycling jersey. Nancy and George are both surprised that Bess has biking clothes, and she says even if she doesn't like to bike, she believes in having clothes for every occasion. Same here. But the girls ride their bikes, and then they have to go pick Amy up from school, but they're slightly late, like 20 minutes late. Amy is not there when they arrive, so Nancy hunts down her teacher, Miss Shields. She says Amy left, but maybe her friend Patricia would know where she is. So Nancy calls Patricia's family's phone number after getting no answer at the Kirkland's house. Patricia's mother answers and says she passed Amy on the road near Amy's house. She saw her getting in a red car with a man with blonde hair. So Amy has been kidnapped by the same person who tried to run Nancy off the road several days ago. Now Terry is gone 2 days for his art show. He left Nancy, Bess, and George in charge of taking care of Amy. So Nancy reports the kidnapping to the police, and an Officer Grant says he'll come to the school at once. Everything is documented, statements are given, and then the girls go home. Nancy tries to get a hold of Terry at his hotel where he's staying, and she has to leave a message for him to call them. She does not want to tell him, "Hey, your daughter got kidnapped," in a voicemail. So the girls make dinner, but they're worried about Amy. Terry eventually does call them back, and he says he heard from the police what happened and he's coming home now. So Terry gets home, and then an hour or so later, Amy shows up. She just walks in the front door. So Terry asks what happened, and all she'll say is the man who took her threatened to kill Terry if she tells him or the police anything. So Terry asks George to call Amy's pediatrician at once. She comes and she examines Amy to see if she's been harmed, which I don't even want to think about all that entails because it's disturbing. But Officer Grant comes by, and Amy won't talk to him either. So everyone agrees to go to bed and talk to Amy more the next day. She's been through a lot. But the next day, Terry shows Nancy a note he found in Amy's jacket pocket. It says, "Kirkland, get rid of Nancy Drew, or next time Amy takes a ride with Mr. D." Underneath that are two initials neither of them can make out, but Terry says Mr. D was slang for death between the soldiers in Vietnam. Nancy says it isn't worth putting Terry and Amy in any further danger, and she, Bess, and George will find a bed and breakfast to stay at. She does ask if Terry can make out the initials on the note, and after looking at it a little closer, he says it looks like NF. For Nick Finney, perhaps? But Terry still doesn't think Nick is the kidnapper or who wrote the note. He says Nick didn't refer to Death as Mr. D, but he called Death the pilot while they were in Vietnam. Terry says he thinks someone else who was in Vietnam with them is trying to frame Nick. So Terry and Nick apparently have this really strong bond from when they were in Vietnam together because he still is unwilling to think that, one, if Nick had been alive all this time, he wouldn't have reached out to him, and he's unwilling to believe that he would have kidnapped Amy. So everyone goes to bed, and the next morning, Amy is arguing with Terry and says she wants to go to the park and she doesn't want to talk to the police. So she runs off to her room and Nancy follows her. Nancy talks to her for a few minutes and she brings up Jimmy, whom she'd overheard Amy mention, and asks if he's Mr. Mai's nephew. Amy admits he is and said she met Jimmy one day in Sausalito with her friend Patricia. He had come up to her and started talking in Vietnamese, not realizing that Amy doesn't know too much of the language. So Jimmy and Amy arranged to meet up every so often after that so they could speak in Vietnamese to each other and Amy could practice, since Jimmy misses his home country and Amy misses her mother. So Nancy asks Amy if Jimmy knew about the trunk, and Amy says yes. But when Nancy asks if he stole the Jade Tiger, Amy says she can't talk about it anymore. So after this, Bess and George have to go to the wedding rehearsal, and Bess is carrying flowers in the ceremony, and George has to carry Japanese bells. Nancy stakes out a cafe near the gallery to watch for Jimmy. When she finally sees him, she follows him, but once he sees her, he tries to take off. But Nancy tells him Amy was kidnapped. Nancy says she needs his help in catching the man responsible. So Jimmy tells Nancy to meet him at Tennessee Valley, and Nancy goes there an hour later. Now, I didn't know this, but it got its name because a ship called the Tennessee sunk offshore in 1853. But Nancy meets Jimmy in the woods in the fog, and he says he knows the man in the red car is Malcolm Elgar, and he's dangerous. He took the trunk from the Kirkland's house, and he says he's from Thailand, and Nancy should be careful if he's threatening her. But when Nancy asks why Jimmy didn't warn Amy about all of this, he says he tried to. Before Nancy can ask more, Jimmy then just runs off. So Nancy goes back to her car, and it won't start. Then someone locks her in from the back seat. The person says, "Just keep quiet and you won't get hurt." And it's Nick Finney, so he is alive. Nick says he disconnected the wires in the car, but he'll reconnect them if Nancy will set up a meeting with Terry. Nancy says he didn't need her for that. Terry still considers Nick a friend. But she asks if Nick is really Terry's friend, though, because of the dog tags in the destroyed box at the show. Nick says he didn't do that. His dog tags were stolen from him back when he was in Vietnam. But Nancy and Nick realize they're going to have to trust each other in order for any of this to work. So Nick asks Nancy to go call Terry while he reconnects the wires to the car, and she agrees and does so. When she gets back, Nick has the car started and is in the driver's seat, and he tells Nancy to get in. Nancy does, even though she's a little bit uneasy, and they go to meet Terry. Once they get there, Nick tells Terry to follow him, and he speeds off. He tells Nancy it's to make sure no one is following them. So Nick and Terry have their reunion, and Nick says he didn't kidnap Amy, but he knows who did. Malcolm Elgar, and he's afraid he could be around and nearby. Nick goes on to explain that he was taken captive for 3 years in Vietnam and finally escaped. He ran into Malcolm in Bangkok, who said he was looking for Burmese jade. Nick had mentioned he had given some to Terry for safekeeping. Terry, of course, didn't know because it was hidden in the false bottom of the trunk. But Nick said he'd thought he could trust Malcolm, but then he'd said something weird about coordinates, and Nick realized Malcolm had betrayed his own unit, which had led to them being held prisoners of war. And by the time Nick pieced all of this together, Malcolm had already been on his way to San Francisco after the Jade Tiger. The Jade Tiger, by the way, which Nick stole when they raided a temple, which he says happens sometimes in war, but he admits that's not a good excuse for them doing it. I'm glad he at least said that, but still, the fact that you stole art from a country that you were fighting a war in is just, ugh. But Nancy says Malcolm stole the trunk and Tiger, then sold it to Mr. Mai, but who stole it from Mr. Mai? But before she can get an answer, the woods catch on fire. Terry, Nancy, and Nick take off running, but Nick hurts his knee, and Terry has to run back to help him. He tells Nancy to go back for the car, but she says she won't leave them. They start to help Nick out of the woods, and then the fire department shows up to help them. Later, Terry tells Nancy a signal flare started the fire, and he's pretty sure Malcolm Elger was responsible. Terry and Nancy are treated for smoke inhalation, and Nick has to stay overnight because of his knee. Terry says he and Nick told the police Malcolm started the fire. Now, the next day is the wedding, so everyone gets ready to go. Also, this is the second wedding Bess and George have been involved in. George was in a wedding in the case of the Vanishing Veil as a bridesmaid, but Nancy, Bess, George, Terry, and Amy all attend the wedding. Nancy shows Amy the famous cake they helped make, the one shaped like a castle, but as Nancy looks around a few minutes later, she notices Amy has disappeared. Terry goes to call the police, and Nancy goes outside to look for Amy. She finds her in some groups of trees with Jimmy, getting a paper bag from him. So Nancy demands to know what's going on. But a voice from behind Nancy says Amy has what Nancy and he have been looking for, the Jade Tiger. And it's Malcolm Elger, and he has a knife. He grabs Nancy and holds the knife to her, demanding Amy hand over the Jade Tiger, and she does. Malcolm then tells Amy and Jimmy to leave and pretend they never saw him. But Nick shows up with a gun, followed by Terry and the police. Malcolm is arrested on all charges, including illegal gun running, and Nick is exonerated. And it turns out Jimmy stole the tiger from his own uncle. He wants it returned to Vietnam where it belongs. And that is the end of the book. Yeah, it wraps up really quickly. So now let's go on to a segment that I like to call What's Cookin'. So in this book, there were mentionings of oatmeal, sandwiches, hot cider, casseroles. In case you were wondering, those 5 casseroles were eggplant, crab, apple, spinach, and turkey, blueberry muffins, juice, pasta, toast, iced tea, salad, lemonade, and cookies. Oh yeah, and then the crazy chocolate carrot cake flavored castle wedding cake. Now let's go on to a segment that I like to call Add That to Your Resume. So for this mystery, I said Nancy could say she's an official wedding cake baker. She helped make that crazy castle wedding cake. And honorary art major. Nancy pretended to be an art major in order to get some information from Mr. Mai at his gallery. So now really quickly, let's talk about the things I liked and didn't like about the mystery of the Jade Tiger. The things I liked: Vietnam is a very touchy subject, but this book didn't shy away from it. It did at least bring it into the fold of the mystery, and there was a good twist at the end with Jimmy stealing the Jade Tiger. But the things I didn't like, I felt like this book had a lot of plot holes in it. It dragged a little, and if I'm being completely honest, it felt very sloppy. I do appreciate the subject matter. I'm glad we incorporated Vietnam into a mystery, but I think it could have been executed better. I also don't like the fact that the villain, Malcolm Elger, is literally just thrown into the end of this mystery, like, oh, this is the bad guy. And sometimes, if that's well done, I don't mind it, but typically I like to be able to kind of guess who the villain is from the very beginning. Also, Nick really didn't pay for his crimes. Yeah, he was a prisoner of war, but he did steal valuable art from this country that he was fighting a war in, so that's a little hazy. I think that could have been handled a little bit better. But when it comes to giving this book a rating, I'm just going to give it a 1 magnifying glass. It wasn't one that connected for me. I didn't enjoy it too much. And I had read this one previous to starting the podcast, and I remembered not liking it when I initially read it. So my thoughts have not really changed too much on this one. So that concludes this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. For next week's episode, we're going to jump into the next book, 105, The Clue in the Antique Trunk. We'll see if this book is similar to the mystery of the brass-bound trunk, and I'll catch up with you guys next week. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.